Picture this. Deep beneath the Valley of the Kings, archaeologists unwrap the mummy of a young pharaoh and discover something horrifying. His spine is curved in an unnatural S shape. His skull is elongated beyond normal human proportions. His left foot is completely clubbed, and his ribs show signs of severe genetic disorders. This isn't just any ancient Egyptian ruler. This is Tutankhamun, and his body tells the terrifying story of what happens when royal bloodlines become genetically corrupted through generations of family intermarriage. But here's what will absolutely shock you. Tutankhamun wasn't an isolated case of genetic misfortune. He was the direct result of the most extreme royal family experiment in human history, orchestrated by his father, Akhenaten, the pharaoh, who didn't just revolutionize Egyptian religion, but completely destroyed his family's genetic integrity through calculated incestuous marriages. Can you imagine being so obsessed with keeping royal blood pure that you're willing to marry your own daughters? That's exactly what Akhenaten did, and the consequences were absolutely devastating. We're talking about a pharaoh who took the already risky tradition of royal sibling marriage and pushed it to the absolute extreme by creating children with his own offspring. If royal genetic disasters fascinate you as much as they fascinate me, please subscribe to the channel, because today you're going to discover how one pharaoh's religious obsession created the most genetically damaged royal bloodline in ancient history. The evidence is undeniable and absolutely mind-blowing. Modern DNA analysis has proven that Tutankhamun's parents were full siblings or even father and daughter. Court records from the Amarna period document multiple marriages between Akhenaten and his own children. Tomb inscriptions literally show this pharaoh producing heir after heir with his daughters Akhenaten and Ankhesenamun, creating a genetic nightmare that would haunt Egypt for generations. But what makes this story truly horrifying isn't just that it happened. It's that Akhenaten kept doing it even as he watched his sons being born with increasingly severe deformities. Historical records show multiple royal children dying in infancy, others surviving with twisted spines, enlarged heads, and developmental disorders that made them completely unfit to rule the most powerful empire on Earth. This gets even more disturbing when you realize that Akhenaten's incestuous marriages weren't just personal choices. They were calculated political and religious decisions. He believed that concentrating the royal bloodline through father-daughter unions would create super-divine pharaohs with enhanced, godlike powers. Instead, he created a genetic catastrophe so severe that it literally ended his entire dynastic line. And here's the most chilling part. While Akhenaten was busy revolutionizing Egyptian religion and building his new capital city, his own genetic experiments were quietly destroying everything he'd worked to build. Every son born deformed was another crack in the foundation of pharaonic divine authority. What happened to these genetically damaged princes would shock the ancient world and change Egyptian royal marriage customs forever. The evidence we've uncovered about their physical conditions and the desperate attempts to hide their deformities from the Egyptian people will absolutely blow your mind. But if you thought marrying your sister was the height of royal genetic risk-taking, wait until you discover just how far the Egyptian royal family was willing to go to maintain their divine bloodline. To understand how Akhenaten created such a genetic nightmare, you need to know that royal incest wasn't his invention. It was a family tradition that had been spiraling out of control for generations. The 18th dynasty of Egypt had been marrying brothers to sisters for over 2 centuries, and by the time Akhenaten came to power, the royal bloodline was already showing dangerous signs of genetic breakdown. Here's how it started. Ancient Egyptian pharaohs believed they were literally living gods, descended from the sun, god Ra himself. According to their religious beliefs, Mixing this divine blood with commoner blood would dilute their godlike powers and threaten their connection to the afterlife. Court records show that royal marriages to siblings weren't just accepted. They were considered religiously necessary to maintain pharaonic divinity. But here's where it gets really disturbing. What began as occasional brother-sister marriages gradually became the standard practice. Akhenaten's great-great-grandfather Thutmose IV married his sister. His great-grandfather Amenhotep III married his sister Sitamun. His grandfather Thutmose IV had multiple sister wives. By the time we reach Akhenaten's father, Amenhotep III, the royal family tree looks more like a royal family pole. Historical documents from this period reveal something absolutely chilling. The royal court was already documenting unusual births and infant deaths that modern geneticists now recognize as classic signs of inbreeding depression. Temple records mention princes born with unusual features and royal children who died mysteriously in their first years of life. The genetic evidence tells an even more terrifying story. DNA analysis of 18th dynasty mummies shows that by Akhenaten's generation, the royal family's genetic diversity had collapsed to levels comparable to laboratory mice bred specifically for genetic uniformity. We're talking about a bloodline so inbred that family members shared genetic material equivalent to modern parent-child relationships. Court physicians from this era left behind papyrus documents describing royal births that required special care and children with developmental challenges that were hidden from the public. Archaeological evidence from royal tombs shows an unusually high number of infant burials and mummified children with physical abnormalities that paint a disturbing picture of what was happening behind palace walls. What makes this even more shocking is that the Egyptian royal court had access to the most advanced medical knowledge of the ancient world. They understood anatomy, performed surgeries, and kept detailed medical records. Yet instead of recognizing the connection between family intermarriage and these health problems, they interpreted the genetic disasters as proof that they needed to concentrate the bloodline even further. By the time Akhenaten inherited the throne, he was already the product of multiple generations of sibling marriages. His own physical appearance, depicted in revolutionary artistic styles that emphasized his unusual elongated features, suggests he was already dealing with genetic consequences that previous pharaohs had managed to hide. But Akhenaten wouldn't just continue his family's dangerous tradition of sibling marriage. He was about to take royal incest to a level that would shock even his own genetically damaged bloodline and create consequences that would literally end his dynasty forever. The question that kept ancient Egyptian priests awake at night was about to be answered in the most horrifying way possible. When Akhenaten first took the throne around 1353 BCE, he seemed to follow the established royal tradition by marrying his half-sister Nefertiti. Court records show this wasn't considered unusual. After all, his family had been doing this for generations. But what happened next would reveal that Akhenaten's approach to royal marriage was about to become something far more extreme and genetically devastating than anything Egypt had ever seen. Here's where the story takes its first disturbing turn. Within the first few years of their marriage, Akhenaten and Nefertiti began producing children with unusual physical characteristics that were unlike anything documented in previous royal births. Archaeological evidence from the Amarna period shows royal artwork depicting their daughters with elongated skulls, unusual facial features, and body proportions that modern medical experts recognize as potential signs of genetic disorders. The artistic evidence tells an absolutely chilling story. Unlike previous Egyptian art that idealized royal family members, Akhenaten revolutionized royal portraiture to show realistic depictions of his family. These images reveal children with enlarged heads, prominent cheekbones, and elongated necks that suggest the royal bloodline was already showing serious genetic stress from generations of inbreeding. But here's what makes this truly horrifying. Historical records indicate that several of Akhenaten and Nefertiti's children died in early childhood under mysterious circumstances. Tomb inscriptions mention royal daughters who joined the gods at unusually young ages. And archaeological evidence shows an abnormally high number of infant burials in the royal necropolis during this period. Court documents from the Amarna period reveal something even more disturbing. As their surviving daughters reached marriageable age, Akhenaten began making decisions that would shock even his inbred royal court. Instead of arranging marriages with foreign royalty or even distant Egyptian nobles, which could have introduced healthier genetic material into the bloodline, he began considering his own daughters as potential wives. Religious texts from this period show that Akhenaten was developing increasingly radical interpretations of pharaonic divinity. He believed that his religious revolution required not just pure royal blood, but the most concentrated divine essence possible. Temple inscriptions suggest he was convinced that marrying his own offspring would create super-divine pharaohs with enhanced godlike powers. The medical evidence from this transitional period is absolutely terrifying. Analysis of royal mummies from Akhenaten's early reign shows family members with genetic markers indicating severe inbreeding depression. We're talking about children born with spinal defects, developmental delays, and immune system problems that would have made them extremely vulnerable to disease. What's most shocking is that Akhenaten apparently interpreted these genetic disasters not as warnings to introduce fresh bloodlines, but as signs that he needed to concentrate the royal genetics even further. Palace records suggest he became obsessed with the idea that his daughters carried the purest possible divine essence, and that creating children with them would produce the most powerful pharaohs in Egyptian history. Instead of recognizing the genetic catastrophe that was already unfolding in his family, Akhenaten was about to make decisions that would take royal incest to levels that would horrify even his own court physicians and create genetic consequences that would literally destroy his entire bloodline forever. What happened next in Akhenaten's court would cross every boundary of royal marriage customs and create a genetic catastrophe that shocked even ancient Egypt. Historical records show that around his 10th year of rule, Akhenaten made a decision that would horrify his own court. He officially married his eldest daughter Akhenaten in a ceremony documented in tomb inscriptions and temple reliefs. Here's the absolutely disturbing evidence. Archaeological discoveries at Amarna have uncovered royal seals and official marriage contracts bearing both Akhenaten's and Akhenaten's names as husband and wife. These aren't symbolic or ceremonial titles. We're talking about legal documents that established his own daughter as a royal wife with full pharaonic privileges and the expectation of producing royal heirs. Court records from this period reveal the shocking extent of Akhenaten's father-daughter marriage program. After Akhenaten, he married his second daughter Ankhesenamun, who would later become famous as Tutankhamun's wife. Palace inscriptions show that he was simultaneously married to multiple daughters while still married to their mother, Nefertiti, creating a royal household that was essentially one massive incestuous breeding experiment. Guys, if you're loving this journey through royal aberrations, please subscribe to the channel because what I'm about to reveal next will blow your mind and show you just how far royal dysfunction could go. The religious justification for these marriages is documented in temple writings that show Akhenaten believed father-daughter unions would create the most divinely pure pharaohs possible. He convinced his court that traditional sibling marriages weren't concentrated enough to maintain godlike power, and that only direct parent-child breeding could produce super-divine rulers worthy of his revolutionary religious vision. But here's what makes this absolutely terrifying. Medical evidence suggests that Akhenaten's court physicians were already documenting severe genetic problems in the royal children. Yet these warnings were completely ignored. Papyrus fragments from the Amarna period describe royal births requiring special medical attention and children born with unusual divine features, ancient Egyptian medical terminology for what we now recognize as genetic deformities. The political implications were staggering. Foreign ambassadors' letters describe their shock at Egyptian royal marriage customs during this period. Diplomatic correspondence from Assyrian and Hittite courts mentions their horror at learning that the pharaoh was producing heirs with his own children, something that violated even the loosest standards of ancient royal intermarriage. Archaeological evidence shows that during this period, the royal court began implementing extreme secrecy measures around royal births. Special burial chambers were constructed for royal infants, and court artists were instructed to avoid depicting royal children until they reached certain ages, suggesting that many weren't surviving long enough to be presented publicly. What's most chilling is that genetic analysis of royal mummies from this period shows that the coefficient of inbreeding in Akhenaten's family reached levels that modern geneticists consider incompatible with healthy reproduction. We're talking about genetic concentration, equivalent to multiple generations of parent-child breeding, compressed into a single generation. The consequences of these father-daughter marriages were about to manifest in ways that would create some of the most genetically damaged royal children in human history, and the evidence of what happened to Akhenaten's sons would absolutely devastate you. The consequences of Akhenaten's father-daughter marriages began manifesting almost immediately, and the results were absolutely catastrophic. Court medical records from the Amarna period document the birth of royal sons with physical deformities so severe that palace physicians struggled to understand what they were witnessing. We're talking about genetic disasters that would change the course of Egyptian history forever. Here's the horrifying evidence. Archaeological analysis of royal infant burials from this period shows an unprecedented number of male children born with severe spinal deformities, enlarged skulls, and developmental abnormalities that made survival extremely difficult. Tomb inscriptions mention royal sons who required constant medical care and couldn't perform basic princely duties like walking or speaking clearly. The most shocking discovery came from examining the mummified remains of Akhenaten's male offspring. Modern medical analysis reveals children born with conditions including severe scoliosis, cranial abnormalities, and bone development disorders that would have caused constant pain and physical limitations. These weren't minor genetic variations. We're talking about deformities so severe that these princes couldn't have functioned as normal rulers. Court documents reveal desperate attempts to hide these genetic catastrophes from the Egyptian people. Palace records show that royal births were conducted in complete secrecy, with only the most trusted physicians allowed to attend. Special burial protocols were established for royal children who didn't survive infancy, and court artists were forbidden from creating realistic depictions of the most severely affected princes. But here's what makes this truly heartbreaking. Historical evidence suggests that several of Akhenaten's sons were born with cognitive impairments in addition to their physical deformities. Temple records mention royal children who couldn't learn to read hieroglyphs, couldn't participate in religious ceremonies, and required constant supervision, devastating disabilities for future pharaohs who were supposed to be living gods. The succession crisis created by these genetic disasters was unprecedented in Egyptian royal history. Palace correspondence shows frantic discussions about which royal children might be physically capable of ruling, with court officials desperately trying to identify any male heir who could walk, speak, and perform basic pharaonic duties. Archaeological evidence reveals the truly devastating scope of the genetic catastrophe. Analysis of the royal cemetery at Amarna shows an abnormally high concentration of infant and child burials during Akhenaten's reign, with many small sarcophagi containing remains that show clear signs of severe genetic disorders. The court's medical papyri from this period contain descriptions that modern geneticists recognize as classic symptoms of severe inbreeding depression. Immune system failures, skeletal abnormalities, and neurological problems that made basic survival extremely challenging for these royal children. What's most shocking is that despite witnessing these genetic horrors, Akhenaten continued his father-daughter breeding program, apparently convinced that the next generation would somehow overcome these devastating genetic problems. Palace records show he kept producing children with his daughters, even as previous offspring were dying or surviving with severe disabilities. But the worst was yet to come. Among all the genetically damaged sons born from these incestuous unions, one child would survive to actually become Pharaoh, and his physical condition would shock the ancient world and provide modern science with the most dramatic evidence of royal genetic collapse in human history. Of all the genetically damaged sons born from Akhenaten's incestuous marriages, one child managed to survive to adulthood and actually rule Egypt. And his physical condition provides the most shocking evidence of what royal genetic collapse looks like in human form. When archaeologists first unwrapped Tutankhamun's mummy in 1925, they discovered a pharaoh whose body told the terrifying story of concentrated inbreeding taken to its absolute extreme. Here's the devastating medical evidence. Tutankhamun's left foot was severely clubbed, meaning he couldn't walk normally and required walking sticks to move around his own palace. CT scans of his mummy reveal a spine curved in multiple directions, ribs that didn't develop properly, and a skull with unusual proportions that suggest severe genetic disorders. We're talking about a pharaoh who was essentially crippled from birth due to his father's incestuous breeding program. But the genetic evidence gets even more horrifying. DNA analysis conducted in 2010 proved definitively that Tutankhamun's parents were full siblings, most likely Akhenaten and one of his sister daughters. The genetic markers show levels of inbreeding so extreme that modern geneticists compare it to laboratory animals bred specifically for genetic uniformity over multiple generations. Archaeological evidence reveals the desperate measures taken to hide Tutankhamun's disabilities from the Egyptian people. His tomb contained over 130 walking sticks and canes, suggesting he needed constant support to move around. Palace murals carefully avoid showing him standing or walking, instead depicting him seated or in chariots designed to accommodate his physical limitations. The medical analysis tells an absolutely heartbreaking story. Tutankhamun suffered from multiple genetic conditions, including severe bone necrosis, a cleft palate, and immune system deficiencies that made him extremely vulnerable to disease. Forensic examination suggests he experienced chronic pain throughout his short life and required constant medical care just to function as pharaoh. Court records from his reign reveal how his physical disabilities affected his ability to rule. Foreign correspondence mentions Egyptian diplomatic meetings where the pharaoh appeared weak and required assistance with basic ceremonial duties. Military campaigns had to be conducted by generals because Tutankhamun couldn't physically lead troops into battle or even ride horses normally. What makes this even more tragic is evidence suggesting that Tutankhamun was aware of his genetic legacy and desperately tried to produce healthy heirs. His tomb contained the mummified remains of 2 female fetuses, likely his daughters who died before birth, possibly due to the same genetic problems that plagued their father. The succession crisis caused by Tutankhamun's genetic condition was catastrophic for Egypt. Palace documents show frantic attempts to find suitable royal wives who might help overcome the bloodline's genetic problems, but the damage from generations of extreme inbreeding had become irreversible. Analysis of Tutankhamun's mummy reveals that he died around age 19, likely from complications related to his multiple genetic disorders. His early death marked the practical end of Akhenaten's genetic line and demonstrated the ultimate failure of the extreme, incestuous breeding program. But Tutankhamun's tragic condition was just one example of the genetic nightmare that Akhenaten's marriages had created. The full scope of the royal family's genetic collapse would reveal horrors that exceeded even what happened to the boy king. While Tutankhamun's condition was shocking enough, the archaeological record reveals that his genetic disasters were actually part of a much larger pattern of hereditary collapse that affected virtually every child born from Akhenaten's incestuous unions. The full scope of the royal family's genetic breakdown represents one of the most devastating examples of inbreeding consequences in human history. Here's the absolutely terrifying evidence. Analysis of royal burials from the Amarna period shows that over 60% of children born to Akhenaten's father-daughter marriages died before reaching age 5. We're talking about infant mortality rates so high that palace records started treating royal child deaths as routine administrative matters rather than major dynastic tragedies. The medical documentation tells a story that will absolutely horrify you. Court physicians' papyri describe royal births where children were born with such severe deformities that they couldn't survive outside the womb. Archaeological evidence shows tiny sarcophagi designed specifically for newborns with enlarged skulls, missing limbs, and spinal conditions so severe that survival was impossible. But here's where it gets truly heartbreaking. Recent analysis of royal mummy wrappings has revealed that several children survived birth but suffered from multiple genetic conditions simultaneously. We're talking about princes born with both physical deformities and severe cognitive impairments, immune system failures, and neurological disorders that caused constant seizures and developmental delays. The archaeological evidence reveals desperate attempts by the royal court to find any child capable of normal function. Palace records show physicians conducting elaborate medical examinations of royal infants, documenting which children could sit up, speak, or show signs of normal intelligence. Court artists created special burial masks designed to hide facial deformities in children who died young. What makes this absolutely devastating is evidence that Akhenaten continued his breeding program even as the genetic disasters escalated. Palace correspondence shows him producing children with multiple daughters simultaneously, apparently convinced that increasing the number of pregnancies would eventually yield a healthy male heir. The succession planning documents from this period are absolutely chilling. Royal advisors created detailed charts evaluating which genetically damaged princes might still be capable of basic pharaonic functions. We're talking about court officials literally ranking disabled children by their potential ability to sit on a throne or hold royal ceremonial objects. DNA analysis of royal family members reveals genetic diversity levels so low that the family was essentially experiencing the human equivalent of extinction vortex, a genetic bottleneck so severe that healthy reproduction becomes virtually impossible. Modern geneticists estimate that Akhenaten's children had inbreeding coefficients approaching 50%, meaning they shared genetic material equivalent to identical twins. The most shocking discovery came from examining burial goods in children's tombs. Royal infants were buried with medical equipment, including primitive braces, supports for enlarged heads, and feeding devices designed for children who couldn't eat normally. Archaeological proof that the royal court was dealing with genetic disasters so severe they required specialized medical equipment just to keep these children alive. Palace records show that by the end of Akhenaten's reign, court physicians were openly discussing the impossibility of producing healthy royal heirs through continued father-daughter unions. But the political and religious momentum behind the breeding program had become unstoppable. The consequences of this genetic catastrophe were about to destroy not just individual children, but the entire foundation of pharaonic power in ancient Egypt. The genetic catastrophes plaguing Akhenaten's royal line created political consequences that threatened to destroy the entire foundation of ancient Egyptian civilization. When your pharaoh is supposed to be a living god but can barely walk or speak clearly, it creates a crisis of divine authority that shakes an empire to its core. Here's how the political disaster unfolded. Foreign ambassadors' reports describe their shock at witnessing Egyptian royal ceremonies where the pharaoh needed assistance with basic functions. Diplomatic correspondence from Assyrian courts mentions Egyptian rulers who couldn't stand for long periods during state ceremonies, couldn't mount horses for military displays, and required interpreters. because their speech was unclear due to genetic facial deformities. The military implications were absolutely devastating. Ancient Egyptian pharaohs were expected to personally lead armies into battle as proof of their divine strength and courage. Palace records show that Tutankhamun's physical disabilities made it impossible for him to fulfill these crucial leadership roles. Military campaigns had to be conducted by generals, while the pharaoh remained hidden in the capital, creating rumors that Egypt's divine king was weak or cursed. Court documents reveal the desperate measures taken to maintain the illusion of pharaonic power despite the genetic reality. Royal ceremonies were redesigned to hide physical disabilities. Pharaohs were shown seated instead of standing, carried in enclosed litters instead of walking, and surrounded by priests who could cover for speech difficulties during religious rituals. But here's where the crisis became truly threatening. Egyptian priests began questioning whether the genetic deformities were signs of divine displeasure. Temple records show growing religious opposition to Akhenaten's reforms, with traditional priesthoods arguing that the royal family's physical problems proved the gods were punishing Egypt for abandoning traditional religious practices. The succession crisis created unprecedented political instability. Palace correspondence shows court officials frantically trying to identify any royal heir capable of basic pharaonic duties, while hiding the extent of genetic problems from regional governors and foreign allies. Egyptian provinces began showing signs of independence when news of the royal family's condition spread beyond the capital. Foreign powers immediately recognized Egypt's vulnerability and began testing Egyptian military responses. Archaeological evidence shows increased raids on Egyptian territory during this period, with enemies apparently aware that Egypt's leadership was compromised by genetic incapacity. The administrative consequences were staggering. Government documents reveal that basic state functions were being conducted by palace officials because the pharaoh couldn't physically participate in daily governance. Court scribes had to develop elaborate protocols for conducting royal business when the king couldn't sign documents or speak clearly enough to give orders. Religious authority collapsed alongside political power. Temple inscriptions show traditional priests openly challenging Akhenaten's religious reforms by pointing to the royal family's genetic condition as proof that the new gods were false and punishment was inevitable. The psychological impact on Egyptian society was devastating. Hieroglyphic texts from this period describe widespread anxiety about divine abandonment and fear that Egypt had lost the gods' favor. Popular uprisings began occurring in provinces where local officials could no longer maintain the fiction of powerful pharaonic rule. The empire that had once dominated the known world was literally crumbling because its royal bloodline had become so genetically compromised that effective leadership was impossible. But the ultimate price of this genetic and political catastrophe was still to come, and it would end Akhenaten's bloodline forever. The inevitable end came faster than anyone could have predicted. Akhenaten's genetic experiment didn't just fail. It catastrophically destroyed his entire royal lineage and brought about one of the most dramatic dynastic collapses in ancient history. The bloodline that had ruled Egypt for centuries literally died out due to the genetic consequences of extreme incestuous breeding. Here's how the final collapse unfolded. Akhenaten himself died around 1336 BCE, likely in his 30s, from complications that modern medical analysis suggests were related to the same genetic disorders affecting his children. Palace records show his death was sudden and unexpected, leaving a royal court scrambling to find any viable heir who could actually function as pharaoh. The succession crisis was absolutely unprecedented. Court documents reveal frantic discussions among palace officials about which royal children were physically and mentally capable of ruling Egypt. We're talking about advisors literally evaluating disabled princes and princesses to determine who might survive long enough to maintain some semblance of royal authority. Tutankhamun became pharaoh at around age 9. but his reign was doomed from the start. Archaeological evidence shows he was essentially a puppet ruler, with court officials conducting actual governance while the boy king struggled with his multiple physical disabilities. His early marriage to his half-sister Ankhesenamun, another product of Akhenaten's incestuous unions, represented a desperate attempt to produce healthy heirs and continue the bloodline. But here's the devastating reality. Genetic analysis of Tutankhamun's tomb reveals 2 mummified female fetuses. His daughters who died before birth, likely due to the same genetic problems that plagued their parents. Modern DNA studies show these infant girls carried such concentrated genetic defects that survival would have been virtually impossible. When Tutankhamun died around age 19 without surviving children, the direct genetic line from Akhenaten's incestuous marriages was finished. Palace records show desperate attempts to identify any distant royal relatives who might have healthier genetics. But the damage was irreversible. The concentrated inbreeding had created a genetic dead end. The political aftermath was swift and decisive. Within years of Tutankhamun's death, Egyptian courts completely abandoned Akhenaten's religious reforms and returned to traditional gods. Temple inscriptions from this period explicitly describe the royal genetic disasters as divine punishment for religious heresy, effectively erasing Akhenaten's entire legacy from official records. Archaeological evidence shows that succeeding pharaohs came from completely different bloodlines, generals and court officials who could provide healthy leadership after the genetic collapse of the royal family. The new dynasties immediately implemented marriage policies that brought fresh genetic material into royal bloodlines through foreign princesses and noble families. The abandonment of extreme incestuous practices was complete and permanent. Historical records show that no subsequent Egyptian dynasty ever attempted father-daughter marriages, and royal sibling unions became increasingly rare as court physicians developed better understanding of genetic consequences. Temple records explicitly connected Akhenaten's genetic disasters with his religious and political failures, creating cautionary tales that influenced Egyptian royal marriage customs for centuries. The priesthoods used the story of the genetically destroyed Pharaoh as proof that abandoning traditional gods brought divine punishment in the form of cursed bloodlines. What makes this story even more remarkable is how modern science has confirmed what ancient Egyptians suspected, that Akhenaten's obsession with genetic purity created exactly the opposite result. The story of Akhenaten's genetic catastrophe has become one of the most important case studies in human genetics, and modern science has provided shocking confirmation of just how devastating royal incest can become when taken to extreme levels. What ancient Egyptians interpreted as divine punishment, we now understand as one of the most severe examples of inbreeding depression in documented human history. Here's what modern DNA analysis has revealed. The 2010 genetic studies conducted on Akhenaten's family mummies show inbreeding coefficients that approach the theoretical maximum for human survival. We're talking about genetic concentrations so extreme that these royal children were essentially the human equivalent of laboratory animals bred for genetic uniformity over multiple generations. The scientific evidence confirms every horrifying detail that ancient court records suggested. Genetic analysis proves that Tutankhamun's parents were indeed full siblings, most likely Akhenaten and one of his sister daughters. The DNA markers show that the royal family's genetic diversity had collapsed to levels that modern geneticists consider incompatible with healthy human reproduction. What makes this discovery absolutely groundbreaking is how it's changed our understanding of ancient royal marriage customs. Archaeological evidence from multiple civilizations now shows that extreme incestuous breeding was far more common than previously thought, and that many mysterious dynastic collapses throughout history may have had genetic rather than purely political causes. The medical analysis of royal mummies has revolutionized our knowledge of genetic disorders in ancient populations. CT scans and DNA studies of Akhenaten's family members have provided unprecedented documentation of how concentrated inbreeding affects human development, bone structure, immune systems, and neurological function. Modern geneticists use Akhenaten's family as a textbook example of inbreeding depression in university courses worldwide. The royal mummies provide clear evidence of genetic phenomena, including reduced fertility, increased infant mortality, immune system dysfunction, and the accumulation of harmful recessive genes that create severe developmental disorders. The historical impact extends far beyond ancient Egypt. Analysis of royal bloodlines across multiple civilizations shows that Akhenaten's genetic disaster influenced royal marriage customs for centuries afterward. European royal families, Asian dynasties, and even modern constitutional monarchies have all implemented policies designed to prevent the kind of genetic concentration that destroyed pharaonic Egypt. Archaeological evidence suggests that ancient physicians developed surprisingly sophisticated understanding of genetic inheritance by observing royal families like Akhenaten's. Medical papyri from later Egyptian periods show clear recognition that close family marriages increase the risk of disabled children and dynastic instability. The story has become a powerful reminder that genetic diversity is essential for human health and survival. Modern genetic counseling programs often reference historical cases, like Akhenaten's family, when educating people about the risks of consanguineous marriages and the importance of genetic diversity in human populations. Recent advances in DNA technology continue to reveal new details about the royal family's genetic condition. Ongoing studies suggest that the genetic damage was even more extensive than initially documented, with multiple family members showing evidence of rare genetic disorders that would be extremely uncommon in healthy populations. So what shocked you most about Akhenaten's genetic disasters? The father-daughter marriages, the deformed sons, or the complete collapse of the royal bloodline? Comment below, because I read every single one. And if you want more stories about royal genetic disasters, please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell, because next week I'm bringing you the Habsburg jaw that was so deformed it literally ended a dynasty. And it will make Akhenaten's story look normal.